Picture this. A small child's cry pierces the frozen silence. Outside, temperatures have dropped so low that spit freezes before it hits the ground. Inside, a cave barely larger than your bedroom. A family of 8 huddles around a fire no bigger than what you'd use to roast marshmallows. This isn't a camping trip gone wrong. This is survival 30,000 years ago, when winter wasn't an inconvenience. It was a predator that killed without mercy. Tonight, we're stepping into the most brutal nights our species has ever faced. Nights when the wrong choice meant your children wouldn't see dawn. When a dying fire was a death sentence. When the howl of wolves in the darkness meant something far more terrifying than any horror movie you've ever watched. But here's what will amaze you. They didn't just survive these impossible nights. They thrived. They laughed. They created art. They told stories that echoed through the darkness and reached across thousands of years to us. So settle in somewhere warm. Feel the comfort of your walls, your heating, your safety. Because I'm about to show you a world where none of that existed. Where humans faced the absolute worst that nature could throw at them, and somehow found ways not just to endure, but to become more human because of it. This is the story of how our ancestors turned the coldest, darkest nights in human history into the foundation of everything we are today. The wind screams across the frozen landscape like a living thing. It carries ice crystals sharp enough to cut skin and temperatures that can freeze your breath in your lungs. This is winter in the Ice Age, not the gentle snow days of our modern world, but a season that hunted humans like prey. Imagine waking up to a world where the temperature outside has dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, where blizzards can last for weeks, where the sun disappears for months at a time, leaving only endless, crushing darkness. This wasn't climate change or a freak weather event. This was life on Earth for our ancestors, year after year, for thousands of generations. In this world, winter didn't just bring discomfort, it brought death. Not the quick, merciful death of movies, but slow starvation as food supplies dwindled. Hypothermia that crept in while families slept. Frostbite that claimed fingers and toes, leaving hunters unable to provide for their clans. And always, the brutal mathematics of survival. One mistake, one moment of carelessness, one fire left unguarded, and an entire family could be gone by morning. But our ancestors didn't just survive these winters, they mastered them. They turned the season that should have ended humanity into the crucible that forged us into something stronger. They discovered that survival wasn't about individual strength. It was about something much more powerful. They learned that the difference between life and death often came down to a single, flickering flame. And as we'll see, that flame would change everything about what it means to be human. In the darkness of the cave, 12 pairs of eyes watch a single flame dance on a piece of charred wood. Outside, the wind howls like an angry beast. But inside, this tiny fire holds back the entire frozen world. This flame isn't just providing light or warmth, it's providing life itself. Fire was the beating heart of Ice Age survival, but not in the way you might think. Our ancestors couldn't just strike a match or flick a lighter. Creating fire from nothing was a skill that took years to master, and even then, it wasn't guaranteed. Striking flint against iron pyrite in freezing temperatures with numb fingers, trying to catch a spark in tinder so dry it crumbled at a touch. This was an art form painted in desperation. That's why the fire never went out. Families organized their entire lives around keeping flames alive. They developed techniques that would make modern survival experts weep with admiration. They learned to bank fires with just the right amount of ash. too little, and the embers died too much, and they smothered. They discovered which woods burned slowly through the night, which animal fats could fuel flames for hours, and how to arrange stones to reflect heat back into their shelters. But fire was more than fuel. It was protection. The dancing light kept predators at bay. Wolves and lions that prowled the Ice Age nights were wary of this strange, flickering creature that hurt without touching. Parents learned to position fires near cave entrances, creating barriers of light and heat that few wild animals dared cross. Most importantly, fire was hope. In a world where darkness could last 18 hours a day, that warm glow reminded everyone that light still existed. Children fell asleep to its gentle crackle. Elders told stories in its dancing shadows. And when someone woke in the deep of night, heart pounding from some nightmare or sound outside, they could look toward that steady flame and remember, we are still alive. But fire demanded constant vigilance, and that vigilance would reshape human society in ways no one could have imagined. The mammoth had been dead for 3 days when the clan realized it would save their lives in ways they never expected. Yes, its meat would feed them for weeks, and its fat would fuel their fires. But as they looked at the massive skeleton, someone had an idea that would revolutionize winter survival. What if home wasn't just a cave you found, but something you built? Ice Age humans became master architects out of necessity. When caves weren't available or weren't large enough, they learned to construct shelters that were engineering marvels. Picture this: massive mammoth bones, some weighing hundreds of pounds, carefully arranged in circles. Curved tusks forming arches overhead. Rib bones creating walls that were then covered with layers upon layers of hide. These weren't crude huts thrown together in desperation. Archaeological evidence shows planning and precision that would impress modern builders. The bones were arranged to create natural windbreaks. Entrances were positioned to prevent drafts from extinguishing fires. Multiple chambers were built for different purposes: sleeping areas, food storage, even primitive workshops where tools were made and hides were sewn. But the real genius was in the insulation. Between the layers of mammoth hide, families, stuffed grasses, mosses, and animal fur, they discovered that trapped air was one of their most powerful weapons against the cold. The same principle we use in modern down jackets was being perfected by people who had never heard of physics, but understood survival at a cellular level. Inside these bone houses, temperatures could be 30 or 40 degrees warmer than outside. A family that would have frozen to death in a cave could sleep comfortably in their mammoth bone home. But building these shelters required something more valuable than architectural knowledge. It required the entire community working together. And that cooperation would reveal something profound about human nature when survival was on the line. The bone needle was no bigger than your pinky finger, but in the hands of a woman named Kira, though she had no name we'd recognize, it became one of the most important tools in human history. As snow began to fall outside her bone shelter, she carefully pushed the needle through thick mammoth hide, creating something that would mean the difference between her children living or dying through the winter. Clothing in the Ice Age wasn't fashion. It was technology. Every stitch was a line drawn between survival and death. Our ancestors discovered that loose animal skins, while better than nothing, weren't enough when temperatures dropped to levels that could kill in minutes. They needed to create a second skin, one that trapped warm air close to their bodies and kept the killing cold at bay. The process was incredibly complex. First, fresh hides had to be cleaned and prepared. Families spent days scraping away fat and flesh with stone tools, then working the hides until they became soft and pliable. They learned to use animal brains, yes, actual brains, to tan the leather, discovering through trial and error that this made the material more flexible and longer lasting. Then came the real artistry, sewing. Using needles carved from bone and thread made from animal sinew, they created fitted garments that were surprisingly sophisticated. Boots stuffed with grass for insulation, pants that fit close to the body, hooded coats that could be layered over other garments. They even created primitive gloves and socks, understanding that extremities were the first thing you'd lose to frostbite. But the most ingenious part was the layering system. Like modern mountaineers, they learned that several thin layers trapped warm air more effectively than one thick layer. A person getting ready for an Ice Age night might put on soft rabbit fur next to their skin, then reindeer hide, then a thick mammoth coat on top. Each layer had a purpose, each stitch a reason. Children's clothing received special attention. Tiny boots, miniature coats, even small sleeping bags sewn from the softest available furs. Because in the harsh mathematics of survival, protecting the next generation was everyone's responsibility. And as the long night deepened, there was one more element that would prove even more critical than the best clothing: the fuel that burned within their own bodies. The marrow slides down Kira's throat like liquid fire, warming her from the inside out. She passes the cracked bone to her youngest son, watching as he eagerly sucks out the rich, fatty contents. Outside their mammoth bone home, the temperature has dropped so low that their breath would freeze instantly. But inside their bellies, calories are burning like tiny furnaces, keeping their core temperatures stable enough to survive. Food wasn't just nutrition in the Ice Age. It was fuel for the internal engine that kept humans alive through impossible cold. Our ancestors discovered something that modern Arctic peoples still understand. When the world around you is trying to freeze you to death, what you eat becomes as important as what you wear. Fat was gold, not just useful, literally the difference between life and death. A successful mammoth hunt didn't just mean meat for the clan. It meant access to the thick layers of fat that could sustain families through weeks of sub-zero temperatures. They learned to crack open every bone to extract the marrow, to save the brain tissue, to carefully prepare and store the richest parts of every animal they killed. But getting food was only half the challenge. Preserving it was an art form. Families became experts at smoking meat over their precious fires, creating jerky that would last for months. They learned to freeze food in natural ice caves, essentially creating the world's first refrigerators. Some groups even figured out how to ferment certain foods, discovering that controlled rotting could make meat safe to eat long after it should have spoiled. The hunting itself had to change for winter survival. This wasn't the casual hunting of warmer seasons. This was calculated, desperate pursuit of animals that could feed an entire clan for weeks. Mammoth hunts required dozens of people working together, using strategic traps and coordinated attacks. A successful hunt meant full bellies and warm nights. A failed hunt could mean watching children grow thinner by the day. And there was a brutal reality they all understood. Sharing food wasn't kindness, it was strategy. A well-fed clan member could contribute to the work of survival, gathering firewood, maintaining shelters, standing watch. A hungry clan member was a liability the group couldn't afford. But even with full stomachs and warm clothes, the night still held terrors that would test their courage in ways no amount of preparation could address. 3 shadows move outside the circle of firelight. Kira's brother Jorak grips his spear tighter, feeling his heart pound as yellow eyes reflect the flames. The wolves have been following the clan for days, and tonight they're testing the boundaries, seeing if these strange creatures with their unnatural fire are as dangerous as they seem. This is the reality of Ice Age nights that no amount of preparation could eliminate. They were never alone. The darkness beyond their fires was alive with predators who saw humans as nothing more than an easy meal. Cave lions bigger than modern tigers, packs of wolves that hunted in coordinated groups, hyenas whose bone-crushing jaws could crack mammoth skulls, and lurking in the deepest caves, the massive short-faced bears that could kill a human with a single swipe. But humans had something these predators didn't: the ability to organize. They developed watch systems that meant someone was always alert, always ready to sound the alarm. These weren't casual guard duties. They were life or death responsibilities that required absolute focus. A watchman who fell asleep wasn't just endangering himself. He was risking the lives of sleeping children, elders, and families who trusted him with everything they had. The watch rotation was carefully planned. The strongest and most experienced hunters took the deepest night hours when predators were most active. They learned to read the darkness, to distinguish between the rustle of wind and the careful footsteps of a stalking lion. They developed signals, specific whistles, hand gestures, ways to alert the camp without making noise that might attract more attention. Fire was their primary weapon, but not in the way you might think. They learned to create torches that could be quickly lit and waved to frighten animals. They discovered that certain materials burned brighter and hotter, creating flashes that could startle even the most determined predator. Some groups developed fire arrows, projectiles that could carry flames directly to threatening animals. But the most important discovery was that humans working together were more dangerous than any single predator. When wolves attacked, the entire clan responded. Men with spears formed protective circles around women and children. Elders who couldn't fight became lookouts and coordinators. Even children had roles, carrying extra weapons or tending fires. The Night Watch wasn't just about defense. It was about creating the trust that held communities together. When you knew someone was willing to risk their life to protect you while you slept, bonds formed that went deeper than family, deeper than friendship. These were connections forged in shared terror and mutual dependence. And those bonds would become even more critical when they discovered that survival wasn't just about individual strength, but about something no other species had mastered. The temperature inside the bone shelter has dropped so low that each breath creates small clouds of vapor. Kira pulls her youngest child closer, feeling his small body shivering despite the layers of fur wrapped around him. One by one, the rest of the family moves closer together, until 12 bodies are pressed tight under a pile of mammoth hides, sharing warmth in the most basic way possible. This is human survival at its most fundamental. The discovery that together, we generate enough heat to live through temperatures that would kill us alone. But what seems like simple cuddling was actually sophisticated thermal management that our ancestors perfected over thousands of generations. They learned the science of shared body heat without understanding the physics. Adults on the outside, where their larger bodies could generate more warmth. Children in the center, where their smaller frames would lose heat fastest. Elderly members placed strategically where they could benefit from others' warmth while contributing their own experience and wisdom. Pregnant women given the warmest spots, understanding that they were carrying the future of the clan. But this wasn't just about temperature. Sleeping together in such close quarters required social skills that went far beyond survival. Imagine sharing a bed with 11 other people every single night for months. Someone snores, someone moves too much, someone gets sick. Tensions that might seem minor during the day could explode into life-threatening conflicts when everyone was trapped together in the dark. They developed unspoken rules and protocols, ways to shift positions without waking others, methods for dealing with illness that protected the whole group. Even simple things like how to get up in the middle of the night without letting cold air under the shared covers became crucial survival skills. The psychological effects were profound. Modern studies of isolated communities show that physical closeness creates emotional bonds that go deeper than family relationships. These Ice Age families weren't just related by blood. They were connected by the shared experience of depending on each other's body heat to stay alive. They breathed each other's air, felt each other's heartbeats, shared dreams and nightmares, in the most literal sense. Children growing up in these conditions learned that individual survival was impossible. The idea that you could make it on your own wasn't just foolish, it was suicidal. They internalized cooperation at a cellular level, understanding that the group's survival was their survival, that the warmth they shared was the warmth that kept them alive. But even with perfect cooperation, even with bodies pressed together, sharing every calorie of heat, the long nights tested them in ways that could break even the strongest adult. The most vulnerable members of the clan needed protection that went beyond physical warmth. The baby's wail cuts through the night like a knife, and every adult in the shelter freezes. Outside, something large is moving through the snow. They can hear the soft crunch of footsteps circling their camp. Kira presses the infant close to her chest, rocking gently, humming under her breath, desperate to quiet the cries that might draw death to all of them. Children were both the reason for survival and its greatest challenge. Every choice an Ice Age family made revolved around keeping their youngest members alive through conditions that pushed human endurance to its limits. But children don't understand that crying might attract predators. They don't know that their small bodies lose heat faster than adult ones. They can't comprehend that their survival depends on absolute cooperation with rules they're too young to fully grasp. The solutions our ancestors developed were ingenious. They created child-sized clothing that was like tiny survival suits, boots lined with the softest fur, hooded coats that covered everything but the eyes, even primitive diapers made from moss and soft hide that could be changed without exposing the baby to freezing air. They learned to pre-warm clothing by the fire before putting it on children, understanding that shocking a small body with cold fabric could be dangerous. Feeding children became a complex logistics operation. Nursing mothers needed extra food and warmth to produce milk, which meant the entire clan had to prioritize their care. When breast milk wasn't enough, they learned to pre-chew meat to make it soft enough for young mouths, and to mix animal fat with other foods to create high-calorie meals that would fuel small bodies through long, cold nights. But the real challenge was keeping children calm and quiet when their lives depended on it. They developed what we might call the world's first parenting techniques, specifically designed for survival. Quiet games that could be played in the dark, songs and stories told in whispers, ways to distract frightened children without making noise that might carry beyond their shelter. They discovered that children who felt secure were much easier to manage in crisis situations. So they created routines and rituals that helped young ones feel safe even when the world outside was full of threats. The same bedtime story every night, the same sleeping arrangements, the same person checking to make sure the fire was banked properly before sleep. The entire community took responsibility for childcare. If parents were sick or injured, other adults seamlessly took over feeding, warming, and protecting the children. They understood that losing any child weakened the entire group's chances of long-term survival. Every baby that lived through winter was a victory for the entire clan, and they knew something else. Children who survived these impossible conditions grew up with skills and strength that made them formidable adults. But even the strongest adults needed something beyond physical skills to endure the psychological pressure of endless winter nights. In the flickering firelight, old Thogan's voice rises and falls like music, telling the story of the great mammoth hunt that happened 3 winters ago. The children lean closer, their eyes wide as he describes the massive beast, its tusks like curved trees, its eyes like dark pools. But this isn't just entertainment. This is education wrapped in narrative, preparing the next generation for the challenges they'll face. Sound was survival in the Ice Age. Not just the ability to hear danger approaching, but the power to fill endless hours of darkness with something other than fear. Our ancestors discovered that human voices could be as warm as fire, as protective as spears, as essential as food. They created the first entertainment industry out of pure necessity. Storytelling served multiple purposes that went far beyond simple amusement. Stories were how knowledge passed from one generation to the next. The tale of a hunter who got lost in a blizzard contained vital information about reading weather signs. The myth about spirits in the deep cave was actually a warning about dangerous gases or unstable ice. Every story was a survival manual disguised as entertainment, but stories also did something more subtle and more important. They created shared identity. When Thogan told the story of the Great Mammoth Hunt, he wasn't just recounting history. He was reminding everyone that this group, this family, was capable of incredible things. They had faced the giant beasts and won. They had survived blizzards that killed other clans. They were not just random people huddled together for warmth. They were heroes in their own epic tale. Music developed alongside storytelling. They created instruments from bone and hide, flutes carved from mammoth ivory, drums made from stretched hide, rattles filled with seeds or small stones. The music wasn't just beautiful, it served practical purposes. Rhythmic sounds could coordinate group activities like hauling heavy bones or processing hides. Songs helped people remember important information, which plants were safe to eat, what signs warned of dangerous weather. Most importantly, sound created psychological warmth. When children were frightened by the howl of wolves outside, a gentle lullaby could calm their fears. When adults felt overwhelmed by the endless struggle for survival, a familiar song could remind them of better times and give them strength to continue. They developed sophisticated vocal techniques that we're only beginning to understand. Archaeologists have discovered that many Ice Age caves have incredible acoustics. Sounds carry and echo in ways that seem almost magical. Our ancestors learned to use these acoustic properties, creating what were essentially prehistoric concert halls where voices could reach every corner of their shelters. But voices could also attract danger, so they learned to modulate sound carefully. They developed whisper languages for times when silence was critical. They created hand signals to communicate when voices might carry too far. They mastered the art of making noise that would drive away small predators while not attracting larger ones. And in the quiet moments between stories and songs, they shared something even more precious: the accumulated wisdom of generations who had survived what seemed impossible. Grandmother Aya's hands shake as she adjusts her fur cloak, but her mind is sharp as the obsidian blade she still carries from hunts in her youth. Around the fire, 3 generations listen as she speaks in a voice weathered by 70 winters. The wind changes when the great storms come. You can smell ice in the air 3 days before it kills. This isn't casual conversation. This is the difference between life and death, passed down in whispered words. In our modern world, we might see elderly people as burdens during a crisis. But in the Ice Age, elders were the most valuable resource a clan could have. They were living libraries, walking encyclopedias of survival knowledge that had been tested in the crucible of dozens of winters. Their memories contained information that meant the difference between smart decisions and fatal mistakes. Aya remembers the winter when she was 12, when the clan ran out of firewood and her father showed them how to burn animal fat in shallow stone bowls, creating lamps that lasted through the longest nights. She recalls the year the regular hunting grounds were empty, and her mother led them to a valley 3 days' walk away, where reindeer gathered when the main herds moved on. This knowledge wasn't written in books, it was carved into memory through experience. But elders contributed more than just information. They provided psychological stability that kept communities together when stress pushed people toward breaking points. They had survived similar crises before. They knew that winter always ended, that food shortages could be endured, that families could survive losses that seemed devastating. Their calm presence reminded everyone that this hardship, terrible as it was not unprecedented. The relationship between elders and children was especially crucial. While adults focused on the immediate demands of hunting, fire tending, and shelter maintenance, elders specialized in preparing the next generation for the challenges they would face. They taught children to recognize animal tracks in the snow, to identify which plants would ease hunger, to read the subtle signs that warned of changing weather. They also served as the clan's emotional center. When conflicts arose, and they inevitably did when people lived in such close quarters under constant stress, elders often mediated disputes. They had the authority that came from surviving longer than anyone else, and the wisdom to know which battles were worth fighting and which were best resolved through compromise. The knowledge transfer that happened around winter fires was incredibly sophisticated. Elders didn't just recite facts. They embedded crucial information in stories, songs, and rituals that made it memorable. A child who learned to start a fire by following the steps in a traditional story was more likely to remember the process correctly years later, when their own family's survival depended on it. But perhaps most importantly, elders maintained hope. They had lived through winters that seemed endless, faced starvation that seemed certain, watched children sicken and recover. Their very presence proved that survival was possible. When the youngest members of the clan looked at Aya and saw someone who had endured 70 winters, they understood something profound. They were part of something larger and stronger than any individual challenge, and that understanding would spark something new in human consciousness. The realization that survival wasn't just about staying alive, but about creating something beautiful in the midst of horror. By the dying embers of the night fire, young Jorak dips his finger into the mixture of ochre and animal fat, then presses it against the cave wall. Slowly, the shape of a mammoth emerges in the flickering light. Not just any mammoth, but the one they killed last moon, the one whose bones now form their shelter, whose meat filled their bellies, whose fat fuels their lamps. This isn't decoration. This is magic, memory, and meaning all painted in red earth and flame light. The discovery that humans created art during the most brutal period in our species' history tells us something profound about who we are. When every calorie mattered, when every moment was focused on survival, our ancestors still found time to create beauty. They carved figures from mammoth ivory, created jewelry from animal teeth, painted stunning murals deep in caves where only they would see them. But this art wasn't separate from survival. It was part of it. The paintings served as teaching tools, showing children what different animals looked like and how they moved. The carvings might have been spiritual objects, ways to connect with the forces that controlled hunting success and weather patterns. Even the simplest decorations on clothing or tools served to identify clan members and establish social bonds. The psychology of creating art during crisis is something we're only beginning to understand. Modern research shows that creative activities can reduce stress, improve problem-solving abilities, and strengthen community bonds. For Ice Age families trapped in shelters for months at a time, art might have been as essential for mental health as food was for physical survival. The technical skill required for this art is staggering. They created pigments that have lasted for thousands of years, mixing minerals with animal fats and plant extracts to create colors that wouldn't fade. They invented brushes from animal hair, developed techniques for using the natural contours of cave walls to make their paintings seem three-dimensional in firelight. Music and art intertwined in ways that enhanced both. Archaeological evidence suggests that many painted caves have remarkable acoustic properties. Sounds carry and resonate in ways that seem almost designed for musical performance. It's possible that art was meant to be experienced not just visually, but orally, with songs and chants that brought the painted animals to life in firelight and echoing sound. The social aspects of art creation were just as important as the artistic results. Creating a cave painting was a community activity. Someone gathered pigments, someone prepared the wall surface, someone held torches for light. Children watched and learned, gradually being initiated into the mysteries of creation. Elders shared the cultural meanings behind different symbols and designs. Art also served as a form of communication across time. When families returned to caves that had been used by previous groups, they could see evidence of those who came before them. The paintings were messages. We were here. We survived. We were human in the same ways you are human. This connection across generations provided a sense of continuity that helped people endure their own struggles. And in the quiet hours of the night, when the fire burned low and everyone else slept, the artists worked by the faint glow of embers. In those solitary moments, surrounded by images of mammoth and bison, horses and lions, they were doing something that no other species has ever done. They were making meaning from suffering, creating beauty from brutality, transforming survival into something transcendent. But even art couldn't eliminate the harsh reality that not everyone would survive the winter, and how communities dealt with loss would reveal another profound aspect of human nature. The small body lies still under the mammoth fur, and Kira's keening cry cuts through the dawn air like a blade. Little Tam, barely 3 winters old, couldn't fight off the fever that came in the night. His breathing grew shallow, then stopped, and now the clan faces the brutal mathematics of Ice Age survival. They cannot carry the dead, cannot spare the energy for elaborate grief, cannot let sorrow paralyze them when others still depend on their strength. This is the hardest truth about survival in impossible conditions. Not everyone makes it. Despite all the preparation, all the cooperation, all the wisdom passed down through generations, the Ice Age claimed lives with ruthless regularity. Children succumbed to diseases that would be minor inconveniences today. Adults died from injuries that modern medicine could easily treat. Elders who had survived dozens of winters finally faced one that proved too harsh, even for their experienced resilience. But how communities handled these losses reveals something profound about human nature. Our ancestors couldn't afford the luxury of extended mourning periods, but they also couldn't simply abandon their dead without ceremony. They developed rituals that acknowledged loss while maintaining focus on the living. Bodies were wrapped in furs, often with personal possessions that showed love and respect. Graves were marked when possible, creating places where memory could live, even when the person could not. The psychological challenges of losing family members in such close-knit communities were enormous. When you've shared body heat with someone every night for months, when their breathing has been the rhythm that lulled you to sleep, their absence creates a void that goes far beyond grief. Survivors had to reorganize sleeping arrangements, redistribute responsibilities, adjust the entire social fabric of the group to account for missing threads. Children's deaths were particularly devastating, not just emotionally, but practically. Every child who died represented years of investment, food shared, warmth provided, protection given, that would never yield returns. But perhaps more importantly, children represented hope, the living proof that the struggle was worthwhile. Their deaths could crush morale in ways that threatened everyone's survival. Yet communities found ways to honor the dead while protecting the living. They told stories about those they had lost, keeping their memories alive in the oral traditions that passed from generation to generation. They named children after deceased relatives, creating continuity that bridged the gap between life and death. They developed beliefs about afterlives and spiritual continuation that provided comfort without requiring resources the living couldn't spare. The practical aspects of death in winter created unique challenges. Bodies couldn't be buried in frozen ground, so they had to be stored until spring thaw, or placed in locations where animals could complete the natural cycle of return to Earth. These weren't callous decisions, but necessary adaptations to environment constraints that allowed no other choice. Perhaps most remarkably, communities that faced regular losses didn't become hardened or cruel. Instead, they often became more compassionate, more determined to protect the vulnerable members who remained. The death of one child led to extra vigilance in caring for others. The loss of an elder motivated younger adults to pay closer attention to the knowledge that might otherwise die with the person. The clan around Tam's small body will mourn him in their own way, then return to the essential work of keeping everyone else alive. Because in the end, the greatest tribute to the dead was ensuring that others lived to remember them. And as the long winter began to show signs of breaking, as days grew fractionally longer and temperatures rose by tiny increments, the survivors would discover that their ordeal had forged something unbreakable. The first pale light seeps through the entrance of the bone shelter, and Kira opens her eyes to a sight she wasn't sure she'd ever see again. Sunlight. Real, warm sunlight, not the pale mockery of winter days, but the golden promise of spring beginning to assert itself against the long tyranny of ice and darkness. Around her, the clan stirs slowly, cautiously, afraid to believe that the worst might finally be behind them. This moment, the recognition that they had survived another winter, was perhaps the most profound experience in Ice Age life. It wasn't just relief, it was transformation. People who had entered winter as individuals bound by necessity had emerged as something deeper, a community forged in shared suffering and mutual dependence. The physical evidence of their survival was written on their bodies and possessions, tools worn smooth from constant use, clothing patched and repatched until the original material was barely recognizable. Bodies leaner but stronger, conditioned by months of careful rationing and constant vigilance. faces marked by wood smoke and wind, but eyes bright with the knowledge that they had faced the impossible and endured. But the deeper changes were invisible, carved into consciousness by the experiences of the long, dark months. They had learned things about themselves and each other that people in easier times never discover. They knew who could be trusted with their children's lives, who had the courage to stand watch when predators circled, who could find strength when everyone else was ready to give up. The skills they had developed weren't just practical, they were transformational. Fire making had become second nature, not just a technique, but an almost spiritual practice connecting them to the force that kept death at bay. They could read weather signs with accuracy that would amaze modern meteorologists. They understood animal behavior with intimacy born of life or death necessity. Most importantly, they had discovered that survival wasn't about individual strength, but about something much more powerful: the ability to become part of something larger than themselves. The clan that emerged from winter wasn't just a collection of people who happened to live together. It was an organism, each member vital to the whole, bound by shared knowledge, common purpose, and deep trust. The children who survived carried special significance. They were living proof that the strategies worked, that the sacrifices were worthwhile, that hope had substance. Every laugh from a child who had made it through the winter was a victory song. Every game they played a celebration of life's persistence against impossible odds. As spring slowly advanced, the clan would scatter to some degree. Hunting parties would range further from the shelter. Individuals would have time for personal projects that winter had made impossible. But the bonds forged in those dark months would never break. They had been welded together at a temperature that only survival can reach, creating connections stronger than blood, deeper than friendship. The knowledge they had gained would be passed on to the next generation, but more than techniques and strategies. They would pass on the understanding that humans are capable of enduring anything when they face it together. That creativity and beauty can flourish even in the darkest circumstances. That individual strength means nothing compared to collective resilience. And in the growing warmth of that spring morning, as the clan emerged from their bone shelter to breathe air that no longer hurt their lungs, they carried with them something that would change the course of human history forever. Thousands of years have passed since that first dawn after humanity's longest night. But if you listen carefully, you can still hear the echoes. They whisper in the crackle of your fireplace on a winter evening. They murmur in the way you instinctively move closer to others when you're afraid. They sing in every story told around a campfire, every song shared in the darkness, every hand extended to help someone through their own impossible night. The Ice Age didn't just test our ancestors, it created us. Every trait we consider fundamentally human was forged in those brutal winters when survival meant cooperation or death. Our capacity for empathy didn't develop in times of plenty. It was born in shelters where sharing body heat meant sharing life itself. Our ability to plan and innovate wasn't learned during easy seasons. It was mastered when next winter's survival depended on this summer's preparation. Think about the technologies that define modern life and trace them back to their origins. The clothes you wear descend from those first sewn mammoth hides. The buildings that shelter you evolved from bone and hide structures designed to trap precious warmth. The communities you belong to grew from clans bound together by the understanding that individual survival was impossible. Even our deepest psychological patterns carry Ice Age DNA. Why do humans find comfort in small, enclosed spaces? Because our ancestors survived in shelters barely large enough for extended families. Why do we feel most creative during challenging times? Because innovation was the price of seeing another spring. Why do we tell stories to comfort frightened children? Because those stories once meant the difference between hope and despair in the darkest nights humanity has ever known. The art that fills our museums, the music that moves our hearts, the literature that shapes our understanding, all of it traces back to those first creative acts performed by firelight in mammoth bone shelters. When Jorak pressed his ochre-stained finger to the cave wall, he wasn't just making a picture. He was beginning a conversation that has continued for 30,000 years, a dialogue between human consciousness and the raw materials of existence. Our ancestors discovered something that we sometimes forget in our climate-controlled, well-lit world, that humans are not meant to face the darkness alone. Every time you reach out to someone struggling through their own winter, whether literal or metaphorical, you're echoing the wisdom learned in Ice Age shelters. Every time you choose cooperation over competition, community over isolation, you're honoring the memory of people who understood that survival was a collective endeavor. The psychological resilience that got them through those endless nights lives on in us. When modern humans face seemingly impossible challenges, natural disasters, personal tragedies, global crises, we draw on mental resources developed over thousands of generations of ancestors who refused to give up when giving up seemed like the only rational choice. But perhaps the most important legacy of those coldest nights is the understanding that beauty and meaning can emerge from even the most brutal circumstances. The cave paintings created during humanity's darkest period weren't distractions from survival. They were part of what made survival worthwhile. They remind us that being human means more than just staying alive. It means creating something larger than ourselves, something that can outlast the winter, the lifetime, the civilization that produced it. Today, when you sit in warmth and safety, surrounded by the fruits of 30,000 years of human innovation and cooperation, you are living proof that those Ice Age families made the right choices. Every time they chose to share the last piece of fat instead of hoarding it, every time they stayed awake to guard the fire so others could sleep, every time they welcomed another mouth to feed because they knew that community was strength. They were investing in a future they would never see but believed in anyway. The fire they guarded so carefully through those longest nights never went out. It burned still, in every electric light, every heated home, every warm embrace between people who understand that we are all, in the end, sharing the same shelter against the darkness. Their voices still whisper in every lullaby. Their courage still flows in every act of sacrifice for future generations. Their wisdom still guides us every time we choose hope over fear, together over alone, light over darkness. The coldest nights in human history taught us who we are, not individual animals competing for scarce resources, but a species that survives by caring for each other. And in every act of kindness, in every moment of creativity born from crisis, in every choice to build rather than destroy, we honor the memory of ancestors who looked into absolute darkness and decided to kindle a flame that would never be extinguished. The fire burns on. The story continues. And somewhere, in the space between the crackle of flames and the whisper of wind, you can still hear them. Kira and Jorak, Thogan and Aya, and all the nameless others who faced the impossible and passed down to us the greatest gift of all, the knowledge that no night is so dark that it cannot be survived. No challenge so overwhelming that it cannot be faced. No darkness so complete that it cannot be warmed by the light we create together. Thank you for joining me on this journey into our deepest past. If you found yourself moved by these echoes of the fire that still burns within us all, I invite you to share this story with others. Because just as our ancestors understood that survival was a shared endeavor, the stories that shape us are meant to be passed from heart to heart, generation to generation, keeping alive the flame of human resilience that began on the coldest night in history and burns still in each of us today.